13 seconds. That's the amount of time Donald Trump paused during his speech at a rally in Greenville, North Carolina, to take in and to bask in his supporters' racist chant, "Send her back, send her back, send her back." 13 seconds. While Trump tried temporarily to clean it up later by claiming that he didn't support the chant and even tried to stop it by jumping in with more of his speech, some members of the media called BS and pointed to that 13 seconds of smug silence during the racist chant. The day after that North Carolina rally that shocked so many people in this country, including people who thought they could no longer be shocked by Donald Trump, and including people living in North Carolina, a state that Trump won with 50% of the vote and that is represented by 2 Republican senators. The editorial board of the Charlotte Observer in North Carolina published an editorial entitled "Send Her Back, a Dark Reminder of Who We Are." Here's a piece of that editorial, quote, "The chant rose quickly from a handful of voices to a chorus of bigotry. It was a chilling moment. It was lock her up in a white hood. It was despicable. It was both a reminder and a warning that here in North Carolina, in America, going back is not that far of a journey." The Charlotte Observer's editorial board also called on Republicans to condemn Donald Trump's racist comments in an editorial entitled, "Are you okay with a racist president, Republicans?" The editorial says, quote, "Our leaders need to stand up and say something. The Republican Party is firmly Donald Trump's party now. It's the party where insults and other ugliness are just being rough around the edges. Instead of standing up for who we should be, they're bowing to the worst of who we are." And joining us now is Peter St. Onge, an associate editor on the Charlotte Observer's editorial board. And Peter, thank you so much for being here. So the pieces that were written in the paper today, very scathing. I wonder, first of all, have you gotten a lot of response to them already?
We have. You know, the response probably mirrors what you're hearing and what people in Washington are hearing. Democrats and moderates were outraged at the president's tweet, and Republicans, for the most part, either jumped to his defense or didn't want to talk about it. I think the Greenville thing was a little bit different. I think more people were kind of troubled by it, including Republicans, but I think that they were able to point to the crowd and say that this doesn't reflect our values and ignore the fact that the president had pretty much said the same thing 3 days before.
Yeah, I mean, Thom Tillis, who's one of the defenders of Donald Trump, who went with him to see the men in the cages. He was sort of in the back where he's walking along with Donald Trump and 2 other. There you are. There you can see him. He's sort of in the back there, seeing these men who are in cages with the vice president. What do you make of his response? Because what Republicans have been trying to do is say, well, the crowd might have been not great, but the president, wonderful.
Well, you know, with Republicans, I think that we know what Donald Trump is, and we know what he always has been, and it may ratchet up a little bit as 2020 approaches, but the Donald Trump that we've seen is the Donald Trump that we're going to get and always have gotten. The difference that we see and what we spoke about in the editorial is the shift in Republicans and how they speak to that decency question. You know, back in 2016, they were willing to raise their hand and say, this doesn't represent our party and doesn't represent our country. And this week, we've seen exactly how much of a shift we've had. You know, Thom Tillis pretty much decided that he was going to pretend that he hadn't read Twitter and didn't even know that Donald Trump had a tweet. It just shows that this party has fully become Donald Trump's party now. Yeah, and he was actually there at the rally. We should make that point. Stuart Stevens wrote this for the Washington Post. He said, "Southerners like me know the game Trump is playing. We have seen it, sadly, time and again. Trump is the rightful heir to Lester Maddox's axe handles and George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door. This open racism will never be forgotten. Trump long ago made his choices. The question for Republicans is simple. What choice will you make?" You know, I had a guy that I interviewed for my book say to me that if Donald Trump had a Southern accent, everything that he's doing would be immediately have been couched as racism long ago. He wouldn't have gotten this far politically. What do you make of the fact that Donald Trump is the person who now, in 20 years, will be the Lester Maddox potentially of our time? You know, it's interesting when we were writing about the 2016 election, and we said, and a lot of other people said too, that this was a decision about where our country was going to go and what we wanted our country to be. And I don't know that we knew exactly how true that was. And we see that so often now. And in Greenville, we saw it. so much and so starkly that I think that as we head to 2020, people are going to have eyes wide open. They're going to know what choice they're making, even more so than they did in 2016.
Yeah, no one's going to be able to pretend it was economic anxiety. If you vote for him again, you know exactly what you're doing, and we will know what you're doing as well. Here's Lindsey Graham, what he said. He says in a tweet today, this was rich. Lindsey Graham says, something I have learned, if you are a Republican nominee for president, you will be accused of being a racist. John Lewis compared John McCain's campaign to being like that of George Wallace. It comes with the territory, unfortunately. Well, here's one person who did what Lindsey Graham said in terms of calling a guy running for president named Donald Trump a racist. Here he is right now.
He's a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. He doesn't represent my party.
What do you make of the fact that Republicans who seemed to know that Donald Trump was racist 3 years ago suddenly don't remember that and now are accusing the people who are horrified by Donald Trump of being unfair to him?
And this is the shift that we're seeing, and not only with Lindsey Graham, but Mr. Tillis as well. Back a couple of years ago, he was at least willing to waver a bit on Donald Trump. He was willing to stand up to him before he backed down, and now we see that he's not really even willing to engage on the question. I think we're seeing that throughout the party, that Republicans are seeing that it's just not worth it for them in their minds to take the heat when it comes to even talking about the president and decency.
Yeah, I do have to say that Mayor P.J. Connolly, who is the mayor of Greenville, North Carolina, did issue a pretty strong statement on the racist chant. So kudos to him. Some people are trying to speak up. Peter St. Onge, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.